The crisis Russia faces is now fundamentally a crisis of leadership, a political vacuum where evasion and anecdotes have replaced a concrete plan for victory or even survival. The evidence is clear and damning. The leaders' answers were empty, lacking any real fire or substance, dominated instead by inappropriate humor and irrelevant historical tangents. This public performance demonstrated a leader who is severely disconnected from the immense existential crises he faces. The contrast between the gravity of the situation, the mounting casualties, the crippling budget deficit, the ongoing war, and the triviality of his answers sent a terrifying signal to the elites and the populace who rely on him for certainty. When the nation is facing a financial and military reckoning, the leader's refusal to offer a clear path forward is a profound display of weakness. The core of the problem is that the leader is no longer setting the national agenda. The crisis is setting it for him. He has lost the initiative to dictate policy. The massive and inevitable tax hikes that are coming are not being implemented because the leader woke up and decided to raise taxes. They are being implemented because the economy is in such a state of collapse that there is simply no other way to fill the colossal growing budget deficit. The financial system is forcing his hand. This simple reality, that he is compelled to announce painful measures to his people not out of choice but out of absolute economic necessity, proves that he has lost control of the budget and the fundamental mechanisms of the Russian state. This lack of control extends to the military narrative. He spoke with enthusiasm about Russian army successes, yet even the highly selective, invented victories he listed sound impotent when juxtaposed with the overwhelming cost and the acknowledged reality of the military stalemate. The ability to control the narrative has been lost. The war propaganda, the very tool he uses to maintain domestic support, is now failing because it is so profoundly divorced from the truth being reported by soldiers on the front line and by independent analysts. This failure to sell the war further underscores the leadership crisis. When a leader cannot even successfully lie about the war, it is a clear sign that the political system is cracking. This display of evasion, of choosing jokes and dismissiveness over offering solutions, creates a dangerous vacuum of leadership. The military, the business elites, and the populace are not looking for anecdotes. They are looking for a plan. The absence of a clear strategy for ending the war, for stabilizing the economy, or for providing certainty is the most powerful signal of all. This vacuum accelerates the erosion of both public trust and elite confidence, which are vital components for an autocratic regime's survival. The leader is visibly retreating from responsibility, a clear sign that he knows he has lost his grip on the political reins. The Valdai Forum was not a moment of strategic triumph. It was a public confession that the state is running on autopilot toward a crisis that its leader is too afraid to confront. We've dissected the immediate crisis of leadership, the absence of a plan. But the deepest, most damaging revelation from the Valdai Forum was not about the economy. It was about history itself. The leader's comments on the causes of World War II were an act of historical suicide, a direct, public self-incrimination that proved beyond any shadow of a doubt the true, dark nature of his current aggression. This was not a mistake. It was a psychological projection that confirmed the identity of the current aggressor. The leader stepped onto the world stage and offered an utterly repulsive piece of historical revisionism. He argued that Poland was to blame for its own invasion in 1939 because it refused to concede territory to Nazi Germany. He asserted that if the Polish leadership had simply yielded to Hitler's demands over Danzig and the Polish corridor, they would not have become the first victims of the Nazi machine. This statement, uttered by a man who claims to fight against a resurgent Nazism, is an astonishing and profound betrayal of the very national myth he uses to justify his war. It is a direct, open apologia for Adolf Hitler's aggression. The chilling implication is simple. This is not a historical thesis. It is the leader's justification for his current actions in Ukraine. In his mind, Ukraine is Poland, a nation that refused to concede its territory, refused to accept his terms, and is therefore responsible for the war and the destruction it now faces. By shifting the blame from the invading aggressor, Nazi Germany/Russia, to the victim, Poland, Ukraine, he has openly aligned his regime with the rhetoric of the most condemned figure in modern history. This act of psychological projection is the most damning confession possible. This ideological self-destruction creates immediate and profound damage. For years, the regime has based its internal cohesion on the myth of the Great Patriotic War, positioning itself as the moral successor to the Soviet victors. That narrative is instantly and irreparably undermined when the leader himself begins to parrot the arguments of the losing side. This failure of the propaganda machine accelerates the political crisis at home. The average citizen, already anxious about the failing economy and the massive war casualties, is now asked to fight and die for a cause whose moral foundation has been sacrificed for a cheap political point. The political damage of this statement is immense. By sacrificing his own ideological legitimacy, the leader has given up the last pretense of moral authority. This is not just a diplomatic blunder, it is a profound political error that further isolates the regime and confirms the worst suspicions of his rivals. The Valdai Forum was meant to project strength, but by defending the actions of the aggressor in 1939, the leader simply confirmed the true identity of the aggressor in 2025. This self-incrimination is a powerful sign that the leader is so deeply lost in his own narrative of grievance and self-importance that he can no longer distinguish between historical fact and his own desperate political lies. The political damage of this statement is immense. By sacrificing his own ideological legitimacy, the leader has given up the last pretense of moral authority. This is not just a diplomatic blunder, it is a profound political error that further isolates the regime and confirms the worst suspicions of its rivals. The Valdai Forum was meant to project strength, but by defending the actions of the aggressor in 1939, the leader simply confirmed the true identity of the aggressor in 2025. This self-incrimination is a powerful sign that the leader is so deeply lost in his own narrative of grievance and self-importance that he can no longer distinguish between historical fact and his own desperate political lies.
We've dissected the profound crisis of leadership and the self-incrimination embedded in the leader's historical analogies. Now we must turn to the ultimate determinant of this conflict, the economy. The third major failure of the recent major address was its complete and dangerous denial of reality regarding Russia's financial health. The leader's boasts of stability and military success were utterly impotent when juxtaposed with the cold, hard economic facts. A display of denial that confirmed to Russia's business and political elites that their leadership has no plan for survival. The core deception lies in the leader's attempt to ignore the accelerating financial collapse. He chose to deflect from the most urgent questions: the soaring budget deficit, the inevitable tax hikes that are coming, and the return of punishing inflation. This isn't a simple oversight, it's a political confession that he has lost control of the nation's finances. The budget is being driven by the relentless, insatiable demands of the military, and the painful necessity of tax increases is a brutal admission that the state is financially cornered. When a government must raise taxes, harming its own economic growth, to fund a war it cannot win, it confirms that policy is no longer based on economic logic, but on financial desperation. The message delivered was not one of prosperity. It was a clear signal that the economic crisis is deepening and the person in charge is out of answers. This economic denial provided the backdrop for his completely fictitious military successes. The leader spent significant time listing achievements on the front line: the supposed capture of 2/3 of Kupiansk, the entry into Kostiantynivka and Pokrovsk, and the seizure of small, insignificant villages. But these boasts are not just exaggerated, they are pure fantasy. The military's own data and the scathing analysis from even pro-Russian military bloggers shows that the real gains are a fraction of what was claimed. His attempts to frame the capture of a few small villages as a decisive victory appear utterly impotent when measured against the immense scale of the Russian army and the staggering human cost of its offensive. This inability to accurately report the war's progress is a major political risk. When the elites realize the military leadership is lying about the war's most basic facts, their confidence evaporates, accelerating the crisis of the regime. The most profound danger of the entire address was the silence. By failing to articulate a concrete plan for fixing the economy, for ending the war, or for stabilizing the financial markets, the leader confirmed to those who depend on him for certainty that there is no plan. The business community needs stability to invest. The military command needs a clear end goal to plan operations. The absence of a clear strategy is a vacuum of leadership that is now accelerating the structural collapse of the state. The jokes, the historical absurdities, and the attempts to deflect were all tools of evasion. But evasion, when faced with an existential crisis, is read by the system as a confession of failure. The collapse is not just financial, it is a collapse of the essential political contract between the leader and the country he purports to control.
We have spent this time dissecting the internal collapse of the Russian system. Now we must turn to the accelerating external threats that are converging on the Kremlin, a crisis that is directly attributable to the leader's colossal miscalculation regarding the United States. The Valdai Forum was meant to project stability, yet the leader's entire demeanor betrayed a crushing fear that his strategic sanctuary is gone. This is a dictator trapped by the very geopolitical currents he thought he could control. The core of this desperation lies in the leader's failure to calculate the risk associated with his confrontation with Donald Trump. The Russian leadership mistakenly viewed Trump's isolationist rhetoric as a firm, dependable guarantee of American non-interference. They bet that his public criticism of NATO was a sign of total abandonment, providing a risk-free window to escalate in Europe and continue the war in Ukraine. They assumed they were dealing with a predictable, business-minded partner. Instead, they provoked an unpredictable, ego-driven force who, once publicly scorned, is now committed to a policy of muscular antagonism. This created the perfect storm. The Kremlin is now facing a threat it cannot comprehend, driven by a personality it cannot predict. The most damning evidence of this panic is the leader's soft, conciliatory public reaction to the threat of supplying Ukraine with the Tomahawk cruise missile. For a leader who has built his entire reputation on aggressive posturing and the use of red lines, his response, merely stating that the transfer would damage US-Russia relations, was a profound act of submission. This is not the reaction of a confident leader. It is the desperate plea of a man who fears the consequence of escalating. He understands that a new level of conventional armament, like the Tomahawk, changes the entire war. The political will to deploy such a weapon is the one thing he always gambled against, and his fear has forced him to avoid any further provocation that might trigger the final political decision. This caution is justified because the diplomatic shield that once protected Russia is gone. The US has demonstrably removed the restrictions that previously bound Ukraine's hands. Key American officials have explicitly stated that unrestricted zones no longer exist. And as we know from press reports, US intelligence is now being shared with Ukraine specifically to facilitate strikes on key Russian energy and military infrastructure deep behind the front lines. This is a direct consequence of the Kremlin's arrogance. By rejecting Trump's offers of mediation and attempting to make him look weak, the Russian leadership guaranteed that the US would greenlight the very actions they feared most. The war has returned to Russian soil, and the Kremlin can no longer hide its vulnerabilities. This confluence of external pressure and internal weakness has created a strategic double-bind. The leader is trapped. He can no longer resort to threats of nuclear escalation because the current American administration has signaled that this is a trigger for direct counteraction, not a deterrent. He is left with only two options: continue the war, guaranteeing economic collapse and the loss of his remaining military strength, or stop the war, guaranteeing political humiliation and the exposure of his strategic failure. The core of his weakness, so clearly visible in his evasive Valdai performance, is the lack of a third option, a successful plan for victory. His position has been reduced to managing a crisis he cannot control, and the overwhelming external pressure he thought he could manage is now the engine of his domestic and military collapse. This confluence of external pressure and internal weakness has created a strategic double-bind. The leader is trapped. He can no longer resort to threats of nuclear escalation because the current American administration has signaled that this is a trigger for direct counteraction, not a deterrent. He is left with only two options: continue the war, guaranteeing economic collapse and the loss of his remaining military strength, or stop the war, guaranteeing political humiliation and the exposure of his strategic failure. The core of his weakness, so clearly visible in his evasive Valdai performance, is the lack of a third option, a successful plan for victory. His position has been reduced to managing a crisis he cannot control, and the overwhelming external pressure he thought he could manage is now the engine of his domestic and military collapse.
We have meticulously chronicled the confluence of strategic blunders, military decay, and political miscalculation that now defines the Russian war effort. Now, we must deliver the final, comprehensive verdict on the ultimate consequence of this conflict. The war has entered an irreversible final phase, and the conclusion is clear. Russia has lost the strategic initiative. The war is now fundamentally unwinnable for the Kremlin, and the final peace will be dictated by Ukraine. This outcome is assured because every internal system designed to sustain the Russian state is being dismantled by its own contradictions and by the calculated external pressure it provoked. The collapse is systemic, a cascading failure that begins at the top. The leader's recent public address, a platform where he was expected to offer clarity and resolve, instead delivered a profound act of strategic surrender. His performance, dominated by empty jokes, evasive answers, and a shocking historical projection that aligned him with the aggressor in World War II, was a political confession. It confirmed to the military and business elites that he has no plan for victory and is merely delaying the inevitable. This failure of leadership accelerates the erosion of the regime's credibility, which is the final crack in the foundation of his power. This political rot is occurring while the army itself is consumed by internal and external crises. The Kremlin's greatest mistake was assuming that its power was absolute and without cost. The army is now being cannibalized by its own policies. Experienced soldiers are held in a state of perpetual illegal service, leading to exhaustion and a moral crisis. The only answer to the frontline stalemate, the politically suicidal mass mobilization, remains the ultimate choice the regime is too afraid to make. This cowardice, however, guarantees that the war will be lost, as the military's effectiveness is sacrificed to maintain a political illusion. The external pressure is now perfectly aligned with this internal decay. The political barrier is gone. The green light given to Ukraine to strike deep into Russian territory has erased the sanctuary the Kremlin thought it had secured. The threat of Tomahawk missiles and the acceleration of military aid are not just symbolic, they are weapons of strategic deterrence. They force Russia to choose between defending its vital economic infrastructure and sustaining its forces on the front lines. This political pivot, combined with the visible decay of the civilian economy, proves that the war is financially and politically unsustainable. The war will end not with a sudden military breakthrough, but with a systemic failure that makes continuation impossible. The panic in the Kremlin is justified because the Russian leadership now knows that its financial resources are finite, and the war, in its current form, is a terminal event. The victory of Ukraine is close because the Russian war machine is being dismantled by its own internal contradictions.